So good afternoon and thanks to everybody who's joined us. And thanks for joining us for this community consultation for quality of life session, which is hosted by the Quality of Life Foundation. I'm Professor Mhairi McVicar of the Welsh School of Architecture at Cardiff University, and I'm academic lead of Cardiff University's Community Gateway project. I'm also a member of the UK-wide Community Consultation for Quality of Life research project, which is led by Professor Flora Samuel and funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. This research project aims to identify and test good practice in community consultation through projects which are currently running in Reading, with an urban room which has just opened this week in Reading, which will then proceed to Cardiff, Edinburgh and Belfast. And you can find out more about the research project as a whole on the CCQOL.org website. The Cardiff team, which is made up of myself, Maimuna Solman and Shorik Nekeb, are preparing to launch a month-long conversation about community consultation in an urban room, which is a physical consultation space in the Grange Pavilion in Grangetown, Cardiff in May. And we're setting this up in a unique context in Wales, in which the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, Wales 2015, places a statutory obligation on public bodies to think about the long-term impact of their decisions and to work in a more joined up and collaborative way with people, communities, and each other, as well as working in a preventative rather than a reactive way. So Wales is doing things differently to the rest of the UK. To give current and future generations a good quality of life, they're thinking about the long-term impact of the decisions they make. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is a law with 7 well-being goals that help to improve the environment, economy, society, and culture. So what does that mean? How does it involve communities in the process? And how can it help the rest of the UK think more long-term? So to discuss these questions, I'm delighted to welcome our 3 speakers today, whose work in collaboration and involvement enacts the principles of these ways of working. So I'm first going to introduce all 3 speakers. Sandy Clubb is the involvement artist for the Office of Wellbeing of Future Generations, a role which she's described beautifully as following her nose in terms of connecting individuals and organisations across Wales, holding conversations which inform and influence the implementation of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. Having been in this role for just over a year, Sandy has worked in regeneration, sustainable transport, heritage, and health in roles focused on involving people and communities, and she sat on the Third Sector Partnership Council. Aisha Ali is a partner in Mela Cymru, a planning consultant in CDF planning, a qualified town planner, and an educator. Her work is underpinned by clear values and an approach to ethical practice that creates with communities and seeks to reduce inequalities. Aisha has extensive experience of working both in the public and private sector, supporting her understanding of the dynamics, opportunities, and challenges of working with diverse communities. She's passionate about meaningful community engagement and co-design in creating inclusive, happy, and thriving urban areas. And Aisha was recently included in the Planners Women of Influence 2022. Ian Titherington is lead officer in drainage at Cardiff Council, and he led on Cardiff's Greener Grangetown, a 9-year, £3 million sustainable urban drainage retrofit in a Victorian residential neighbourhood. Ian prioritised resident involvement, achieving resident-led design decision-making on each street by allocating budget resources to on-the-ground liaison throughout the design and the construction of the project, exemplifying what can happen when involvement is prioritised from the start and throughout each stage of a project. So we're going to begin with a short provocation from each speaker, after which we'll kick off a conversation about what consultation means, and we'll open up to questions. We'll start with Sandy, who describes good involvement as values-based, as a way of approaching things rather than necessarily a thing that we do. Sandy, I'm delighted to welcome you, and I'll just share the screen to get us started.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much, Mariam, for the intro as well, and for sharing my slides. So yeah, conscious that this is a UK-wide audience, so I'm going to start just by kind of building on the intro that we just had to the Future Generations Act and what it means. So if I could have my next slide, please, Mary. Diolch. So as we've already heard, the Act came into being in 2015, and it embedded the principle of sustainable development, which had been there at the core of the devolution project in Wales from the start. But this legislation, excitingly, makes Wales the first country in the world to have sort of literally legislated that public bodies have to bear in mind sustainable development in the way that they work. So they have to focus on improving the economic, social, environment and cultural well-being of Wales. And that fourth dimension of sustainable development, the cultural, is particularly important to us, that we've added that here, and that includes, for instance, making sure that the Welsh language is thriving in our communities. So all 44 public bodies covered by the Act, including the Welsh Government, must act in accordance with the Sustainable Development Principle, which aims at achieving the wellbeing goals. And as we've heard already, there are 7 goals in total, which are depicted on the right-hand side, and they're based around the UN Sustainable Development Goals, to incorporate all of them in this kind of vision. So that's the other thing that's really groundbreaking and unique for Wales, is having this vision that was co-created by the people of Wales, that all future governments can kind of be part of delivering. So in addition to the wellbeing goals, we also have the 5 ways of working, which all of the public bodies must follow in the way they work. And so they're down there on the left-hand side. So following the prevention principle to ensure that the actions they take don't worsen problems such as climate change and poverty, etc. The involvement principle, which we're going to be talking about in detail today. Crucially, thinking long term. So, casting ahead, thinking how a decision is going to impact on people yet to be born, and thinking ahead, as long term as sort of 25, 30 years in the future. And that can be really game changing in terms of the types of policies that you then start to make. So they also have to work in an integrated way across different policy areas to prevent silo working, and also work in collaboration with organisations across different sectors. Thanks, Mary. So briefly, the role of the Commissioner. So this is Sophie Howe. Sophie is the first Wellbeing and Future Generations Commissioner in Wales. She's in her final year of a 7-year term. So from April next year, we will have a new Commissioner. And her main duty as Commissioner is to act as the guardian of the ability of future generations to meet their needs, and then also to encourage public bodies to take greater account of the long-term impacts of what they're doing. So something that we find ourselves kind of saying quite often is that we're the coach rather than the referee. So compared to, say, the Welsh Language Commissioner or the Children's Commissioner, we don't have a casework function. So we can't kind of challenge individual decisions, but what we can do is promote best practice, highlight where things are being done really well, and be part of what we kind of call this building a movement for change around the Act. So in terms of the involvement responsibility, the public bodies must take account of the importance of involving other people that have an interest in the decisions that they're making. So that might be on a Wales level for public bodies like Amgueddfa Cymru, or it might be locally where they're based. And they must make sure that they're involving a diverse range of people in what they do as well. Thanks, Mary. Seamless slide changing. So then in terms of kind of the how, how is it that that involvement principle then starts to make a difference to what the public bodies are doing? There are a few kind of important mechanisms. So one of those is the wellbeing assessment. So all of the public bodies sit on things called the public services boards that come together every 5 years to assess wellbeing across their local area, and then they use those assessments to set their wellbeing objectives and plans for the following 5 years. And there's a responsibility within doing that to involve people locally. And a lot of the work that we're doing as an office is with those PSBs and looking at, you know, how they're increasingly working in more of a co-productive way to make that involvement more meaningful. So another really important mechanism, and I know that this is something Ian is going to build on in his talk, is around how the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is becoming embedded in other legislation and kind of policies. So the recasting of the planning policy in Wales a few years ago was a really good example of this, and the Act is kind of embedded all the way through, and as a result involvement features highly in terms of how public bodies should undertake their planning responsibilities. Excuse me, it's going to get a quick sip of water. And then lastly, just to kind of, this is a brief kind of taste of the work that we do on involvement as an office. I won't run through all of this, but you know, for us, the main focus is on hearing the lived experience of people across Wales and making sure that their voices are coming through in the work that we do. So whether that's recent work to promote universal basic income and a shorter working week, some of the exciting projects on here that I'm involved in at the minute are sort of Democracy Box. We're doing some co-creation of communication around the Act with young people to young people, and then some work with groups that don't often get their voices heard around climate change in our partnership with Flint. So that's enough of me for now. I know we're going to have some questions shortly. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you so much, Sandy. And just to continue our introductions, I'm going to invite Aisha Ali of Mela Cymru and CDF Planning. And Aisha prioritises early conversations in communities before any brief is written in order to challenge generic assumptions of what and who a community is. So Aisha, I'm delighted to welcome you, and I'll just share the screen to get you up and running. So if you give me a second. Great, there you go. Okay, thanks. So if we can just take you off mute, Aisha. Thanks.
Hi there. Hi. Thanks, Mhairi. I'm Aisha Ali, and I'm a partner in an organisation called Mela Cymru. And as Mhairi explained, our main focus is to engage and co-design with the community in a very meaningful way. Next slide, please, Mhairi. So looking at some of our core values at Mela Cymru, we believe passionately about putting the people at the heart of the co-design process. And we believe that this is what creates creative communities by empowering people and giving communities a voice. The long-term benefits outweigh the kind of upfront loading of the time spent in engaging with communities. So we define meaningful engagement by 3 core principles adopted by the Intercultural Cities Network around diversity advantage, equality and intercultural interaction. So our focus again is very much about being very inclusive, you know, taking advantage of diversity and also interact with communities in a very open, equal way to I guess get maximum output out of the communities. So in terms of the diversity advantage, we also very much work around an asset-based approach where we recognise and work closely with the assets within the community and almost like empower communities to make them feel that their contribution isn't only because we're asking them for their opinions, but also to make them feel appreciated and that their assets are being brought forward and being used as part of the engagement and co-design process. They're very much about promoting equality at Mela Cymru, and we acknowledge and understand that communities aren't homogenous. There are layers of communities and there are different protected characteristics that need to be addressed and understood whilst communicating, engaging and co-designing with communities. And as you can imagine, there are specific requirements for different segments of the community, which will then, we believe, draw policies that are relevant to those particular groups within those communities. So in terms of intercultural interactions, again, we very much promote this in Mela Cymru. We think it's very important to have a very open approach in addressing cultural nuances and understanding people's lived experiences and how that affects them on a daily basis, and how decisions made by authorities have an impact on them. And to understand that, we really do try and get under the skin of understanding cultural differences as well, and equally elements that bring us together and things that we have in common with different cultures. So we also very much have an approach where we challenge unconscious biases, and also we understand that we all have cultural biases, you know, when we're dealing with people in general. So to highlight and to recognize these biases and assumptions early on in the process, we feel it helps in the long term, because we've already understood the barriers and almost understood the challenges of engaging with communities. Next slide, please, Mhairi. So I'm sure you've come across this diagram, this picture before. We absolutely love it at Mhairi Cymru, because this is essentially what we try and do and achieve through our work. We'd like to think that the projects that we take on, we're actually doing with communities rather than doing to and doing for. We very much believe in about, as I mentioned before, empowering communities and making them feel as their voices are valuable and that they are an integral part of the whole design process, whether that be a brief or framework or a master plan, or even most recently, we worked quite closely with the Welsh Government in the Race Equality Action Plan. And again, we wanted our participants and our community groups to feel that they were actually shaping the policy and the plans within the Race Equality Action Plan with us and the Welsh Government, rather than us telling them what we think should be done. Next diagram, please. Next slide. Again, I'm sure you've come across this ladder of participation before. This is just to illustrate where we are at Mhairi Cymru. So we like to think that we're at stage 6, 7, and 8. We kind of prize ourselves on not taking on any projects where we feel where it's a very, I guess, low level of participation, and often enough, you know, we've actually walked away from projects where we've thought that the citizens and the communities we're working with aren't being given that voice and being involved in the co-design process. Next slide, please. So again, I think this is a brilliant definition of co-design. Again, it's about sharing power and planning and delivering together. We feel by creating these systems within the design process or within engagement, you essentially are, you know, ironing out issues and problems that might occur in the future. So by involving communities at a co-design level, it's very much about creating a long-term sustainable approach towards that project. And also statistics show that where communities have been involved heavily and they've been given that voice and that space from an early on in the process, in the long term, it's those projects that are more everlasting and more sustainable in the future. So this is why we very much believe for co-designing with communities. And finally, the last slide. So we get asked time and time again by organizations and agencies, where do we find communities to engage with? How do we understand and underpin community challenges in actually engaging? So we use this diagram as a basis, I guess, in understanding the different levels of community groups and community people. So this very much helps us in our approach, where by the time we've completed our engagement plan, we've included all these levels of community members within that plan. We're working on a project at the moment in Newport, and we're working our way through these levels, and the insights and the lived experiences that we are actually unpacking with these different levels is quite mind-blowing, in the sense of the perspectives and the ideas, and also the aspirations of the different levels are very much kind of very tailored towards those community groups. So this is a diagram that we use time and time again. in reaching out to communities and engaging and co-designing with communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Aisha. And just a lot to pick up there from both Sandy and yourself in terms of lived experience and asset-based approaches. And I think that's a questioning of sharing of power. I'm going to go to our third guest now, Ian Titherington, who's dedicated 9 years of his life to bringing sustainable urban drainage scheme to life and spending much of that time in conversation with residents of the retrofit scheme. So Ian suggests that if a consultation is not a conversation, it's not enough. So Ian, I'm delighted to welcome you. And if you give me a moment, I'll just bring up your slides as well. So if I share screen. Okay, over to you, Ian.
Well, good afternoon, I should say, not good morning anymore. My name is Ian Titherington. I'm a council civil engineer in Cardiff Council for far too long. What I'll talk briefly about this afternoon is a sustainable drainage project that we completed about 4 or 5 years ago in Cardiff. And the important element of conversation and consultation with the local community and local businesses before, during and after the project was completed, and trying to understand the importance of how much of a benefit it was to the project. This project was a partnership project between Cardiff Council, Welsh Water and Natural Resources Wales. It wasn't seen as a council project, it was seen as an arm's length project. And that was a very important message, because when you're trying to build up trust with the local community, when you're going to be retrofitting their streets with sustainable drainage, you have to have a conversation, you have to have an element of trust, and you have to build up a relationship over time with the community, because it can be quite disruptive. Next couple of slides, please, Mhairi. This is the curriculum briefly about different responsibilities between the different organisations. We formed a formal partnership before the scheme was even put together in terms of design, and we set up all those formal boundaries so we could all understand each other's priorities and understand how we work together. That includes including communications with the local community. We all put our part in terms of working together, resourcing and understanding what needed to be done. Next one, please. Okay, this is the area in Grangetown in Cardiff. It's inner city Cardiff. It's near the docks. It's not suburbia. It was quite a challenging area to do this sort of retrofit work. Nothing had been done on this size anywhere in the UK before of its type. The actual community is very, very multicultural. There's 49 different languages other than English spoken in local primary school. So it's smack in the middle of multicultural Cardiff docks, which is great. I live there myself. It's an amazing place to live. Really nice place to eat out, by the way. And so that challenge of communication was not just about age or about transient population. It was about culture, community and language. And we had to rise to the challenge to ensure that we could speak to as many people as possible. Next one, please. Just to give an example, I'll quickly flick through the feasibility study. We looked at initial designs and ideas. And when you are going to consult with the community and with businesses, it's really important to lay down the parameters of what you can achieve and what you can't achieve in terms of what flexibility there is, in terms of hydraulics, in terms of street layout. So what they can affect in terms of design and what they can't affect. I think it's very important to draw those lines so they know there's flexibility, but we can't completely turn things on their head. There's limits to what we can achieve. But what we can be flexible in, offer that as an option, which is very, very important in terms of consultation. Next one, please, Mike. Again, this is a move on. This is the early stage design of one of the streets. There's 12 streets we look to put sustainable drainage in. Each one of them is different because each street wanted something different. We looked for the majority views, we consulted, we involved them a lot. We used every conceivable form of communication you could possibly think of: social media, door knocking, street surgeries, Facebooks, YouTube videos, really through the local schools, through the local mosques, other places of worship. You really need to work hard to get the community involved. And frankly, from my perspective, until they start complaining about the stuff coming through the door all the time, I don't think we've hit base level. You really need to get them to come back and say, oh God, not another newsletter. That's when you know you're reaching the baseline in terms of getting at the community. Next one, please. We see the design change. What we did, we said, look, there are options here. So we looked at different types of trees and vegetation. We're putting what's called biofiltration, sustainable drainage systems, which sounds really posh. It's just basically called the rain garden. It filters water from the highway and with drainage, cleans it and takes it to the river instead of allowing it to go in the sewer system. Go 8 to 10 miles through treatment works and out to sea. So we're letting grass and gravity do all the work. And it does work. It's been working very well in Grangetown since we installed it. But what we realised was that street design and layout was flexible. So we looked at curvy streets with different forms of parking, different percentages of parking, what street furniture they wanted or didn't want, what sort of planting, even down to the level of this is what they look like in the different seasons, what sort of colour and green would you like throughout the calendar year in terms of what you want in your street, what species of trees, is what they look like, what would you be interested in. So we went down to that level of detail in terms of flexibility because we could offer it, therefore we did offer it, and we told the residents when they'd chosen that you said we did. Very, very important message. Next one, please. Again, this was the final street design for Bargo Street. There were 6 different designs to this street. We went through an initial one and then went through another 4 and came up with this one as a final design, which was actually constructed and is here today. I'll show a couple of pictures at the end of this brief presentation. So that was largely to do, this street liked the green, but also wanted parking spaces. They didn't want to lose existing trees, but wanted more space. It's trying to get the balance right and trying to, parking is the single biggest issue. That consultation element is absolutely critical before and during the construction. During the construction, we had a member of the contractor employed 50% of his time to go around liaising with residents. He wore a special top and a special hard hat so they could see him, and he was a link between us, the design team, and the and the local residents. To have that link is really, really important because he felt like one of them. People could talk to him and he could get back to us very quickly on mobile phone, and we could respond very quickly. And that element of response, whether it's yes or no, is important because it shows you're listening to what they've got to say. Next one, please. This is how not to present. I thought I'd just check this one in because as an engineer, I think this is great. This is what's called multi-benefits. And my colleague talked earlier about the importance of the legislation in Wales. Wales actually has unique legislation globally as well in sustainable drainage. It's the first country in the world to have statutory delivery of a sustainable drainage in certain circumstances of development. No other country in the world has that. And what that legislation does is it allows me as an engineer and what's called a SUDS Approval Board officer to latch on that legislation to the future generations legislation. It's very, very powerful legislation. It's statutory, so if you don't meet the 6 standards, you don't build, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. There's no appeal process. So you have to be careful with it. You have to use it consistently. But for things like multi-benefits of projects, the multi-benefits that these can bring to a community, which links very, very closely to the future wellbeing legislation. It's very, very important to get that message across. But we didn't give this to the local residents because that's just blurred. People wouldn't understand that. So when we present things, we strip all the technical information out. I'm not trying to be patronizing. We're trying to get people to visualize what we're trying to achieve. So we try to keep the technical stuff away and try to put it in a visual format that people can understand. Next one, please. Just to go through a few final points before a couple of pictures at the end. These are some key points I thought of this morning in terms of what I learned from retrofit. The consultation is a continuous conversation before, during, and after the project. It's not just a 2-week or what we're about to let you know we're going to dig up the street. As engineers, we frequently make that mistake, and we still make that mistake predominantly because the funding mechanisms in the public sector give you a very tight deadline to complete schemes, and that's no good for retrofit. If you want to consult properly, you need more time to talk to local residents, more time to talk to local businesses, because through that, you actually get better design. Because when you live and work somewhere, you see it very differently from when you are trying to re-engineer it. And that input is really, really important. And our design in Green and Grangetown was better because the local residents tipped us off about little things that would work and wouldn't work. Very, very helpful. Cost of consultation for both time and staff. You have to fund and cost it. You might think it's an additional cost, but good grief, it's worth it. It really is worth it in terms of what you get out of the scheme, and also the element of trust you build up with the local residents and the buy-off you get, and the pride, the sense of pride that they feel when a scheme has been delivered that they've been actively involved in. That is worth gold. That is worth absolutely everything in terms of delivering street engineering. Reach out through every conceivable method of communication for all generations. Reason why I refer to generations, if you're under 30 or 40, it's going to be social media. If it's over that, it's going to be door knocking, it's going to be public meetings, it's going to be street surgeries, it's through schools. We use 2 local primary schools to plant 2 of the large rain gardens. When you've got parents who can't speak any English, the children can, and their parents' languages, you get at the parents through the children. Really, really important. And those methods of communication, you have to think of everything you can do to get to people, to ask their opinions, and whether they like it or not. It's so important that you have that conversation. Set parameters of what you can and cannot do. There's no point offering something you can't deliver. Offer something you can deliver, and then be absolutely clear about what you can't deliver. That's very, very important, because they'll ask for more that you can deliver. Once you're clear and straight with them and you're consistent, that's very, very important. Let people know when they've given an opinion, it's changed design and for the better. That's very important. We did a "you said we did" newsletter, and people like that because they've never had that before in this area. You know, they have a letter saying something's going to be done, but they don't have that involvement, and that's what consultation is, an involvement that can make a difference. And that's really important, to let them know that they've made a difference. Respond very swiftly to concerns. If you're in a local authority, it's usually a 7-day response if you get a complaint or something, or 5-day response or whatever. Can't even remember what it is. I should know as an officer. We were turning them around in 12 hours, 24 hours maximum. If it's on social media, they expect a response within a couple of hours. If it's any longer than that, they think you're too late. So you've got to be set up to respond. And finally, proper consultation. It means better design. And when I mean better design, it means a better design in terms of engineering. It means better time in terms of acceptance of the community and the local businesses. And that's what you deliver. So find a couple of pictures before and after, just to show the difference that when you have proper consultation. This is one of the streets in Grangetown. We came in, we spoke to residents, asked what they wanted, and then the next picture, and this is what it turned into after. That's it. So basically, we're using sustainable drainage, but this is the design layout that this street wanted in terms of the rain gardens, in terms of parking, in terms of space, in terms of safety for cyclists, safety for pedestrians, and priority for local residents for their cars. No longer a commuter car park, but a residential area that people could grow up in, feel greener, feel cleaner, and feel happier in an environment. And that's what good consultation delivers. That's it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ian. And just to invite Sandy and Aisha to come back and to unmute yourselves as well, so we can have some conversation. So there is a question that's been posted in the Q&A, which I'll come to in a moment, but I just wanted to kick off a conversation just by coming back to each of you to ask about your definition of consultation, and perhaps to reflect a bit on the way in which the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is changing or challenging our definitions of consultation. So if I could perhaps start off with Sandy, and then Aisha, and then Ian, and then we'll go to the questions in the chat.
Thanks, Mhairi. So I think often, you know, the question about definitions can get quite bogged down in a way, and you know, wondering about what's the difference between consultation and what's the exact definition of involvement versus engagement, for instance. But for me, I think the difference the Act has made has been that wherever people are operating on kind of the spectrum of engagement, it's making that interaction more meaningful. And sort of that's an important word that Ian used a lot. It's those meaningful conversations. So I think one of the main distinctions for me is kind of involving people early enough. And again, that came across strongly, I think, in that example around Green and Grangetown was, you know, Ian said a number of times, you need to have the time to do this properly. So this isn't a case of, right, we've made most of the decisions and it's happening in 2 weeks. Here are some kind of tick box questions that we're just going to get you to sign on the dotted line. It's really involving people early enough in the process that their views can meaningfully shape what you're doing, and that you have enough scope and flexibility in your plans to be able to say, do you know what, we need to pivot, we need to change, because what we've learned is that some of our initial ideas were wrong, it's not going to work, and we're going to shape this with people. So it's much more about going on that shared journey together and doing things with people rather than to, which was a point Aisha made very well with that. Yeah, brilliant slide.
And thanks, Sandy. And obviously they've got the statutory power from Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, but I know that Aisha has worked with local developers and with housing associations on that question of cost that Ian also raised, you know, the sort of building in and budgeting for meaningful engagement. And Aisha, I wonder if you could perhaps reflect on that a bit.
Yeah, no, completely agree with Sandy and Ian, the points that they've raised. I think the one thing I will say is when it comes to consultation, often people are fatigued as well. And over time, what's seen as consultation actually is just a tick box. And I think it's a really good place where we are at the moment in Wales, because we are moving away from that approach. And I think some communities are finally understanding, thankfully, that it's not just a tick box anymore. However, we do have those challenges time and time again. When we work on projects, we are often told by communities, well, what's the point of us contributing? Will you actually listen to what we're saying? And I think that's where co-design and co-production comes in. You know, there's a distinct difference in our approach between consultation and co-design. I think, Ian, the example that you showed off the street, you know, that directly responded to what those residents wanted for their street. And so they live on that street. They have to walk on that street every day. So surely they should be part of co-designing how their street or their neighborhood looks like. So I think the old traditional way of surveys and questionnaires, you know, I mean, yeah, they do play a role, but I think we do need to go a bit deeper now. And you know, one of my ethos is about creating sustainable, thriving neighborhoods. And who best to do that and lead on that than the communities that live in those neighborhoods?
And Ian, you worked on a fairly unique project in that you had the budget to be able to do long-term consultation and to get that deeper engagement that both Aisha and Sandy have mentioned. And I know that that's a sort of push for you now. Is how do you bring that forward, and how do you bring it forward into projects where that's perhaps not built in from the start?
Yeah, I think it was the money, but it was also the time. I didn't have a deadline to meet, although it probably took too long in the end. But not in terms of consultation, in terms of delivery. But my difficulty still is, say, if I'm working with the authority, I got colleagues that work in different areas that put budgets together for schemes, and they're as keen as I am to have these conversations. But they got one hand tied behind their back because they got to spend everything by the end of the financial year. And that stops us from having these meaningful conversations. And this is where we lose the trust with the local residents and local businesses. And there are examples in Cardiff now where that's happened and is happening. And it's not what we want, but it's where the funding mechanism is coming, which is saying you have to spend it. And that's the one thing that's stopping, in my opinion, stopping meaningful consultation and conversations to give better design. And I think that's something that the budget holders and decision makers need to reflect on, along with how you cost, say, a construction scheme. They'll look at the budget line and what you get for it. But what I say is, well, you should cost it on the whole benefit analysis of that scheme. So if you're delivering multi-benefits, which is what the Future Generations Act wants you to do, you're getting health benefits, social benefits, economic benefits, financial benefits, ecological benefits, environmental benefits. You know, Greening Grange delivers all of that. Actually more than we thought it would. We put these graphs up thinking it won't get that half as good as that. It actually went beyond it, which is quite annoying. I didn't expect it to happen. But you have to cost that and understand how much more you get for your money. So if I went into a street and put sustainable drainage rather than standard drainage in, it's going to cost more. Not massive amount more, but it's going to cost more. But the amount of extra it delivers is incredible. You know, the whole place changes. People's perception of a street and a community completely changes because of a drainage scheme. And that needs to be costed and understood by the budget holders and the decision makers in power, in local government, in national government. And those mechanisms, those costing mechanisms are already out there. Consultants have them, organizations have them. They're well used and understood, but not by the budget holders, decision makers. And that will enable us to have more time and more understanding of the importance of proper consultation. Because it wins communities over. You build up trust, you get better design, you spend money better, you get more for your money. It really is that simple. But unfortunately, we're still wedded in the old days of that's the budget, that's what we deliver, move on. We need to understand, particularly with climate change, frankly, we need to understand, we need to change that and bring people in to the communities that they live in when those changes are made.
There's several questions popping up in the chat, but I think one speaks directly, the first one from David Farnsworth speaks directly to how we might measure success. And I think that's something that you're touching on there, Ian, is how do you measure the value and the success of consultation? So a question here about how many residents as a proportion of Grangetown total were directly involved by giving their views. So when do we know that we've done doing consultation successfully? Is it dependent on numbers? Is it dependent on the depth of engagement? But any thoughts on that, Ian?
We got to about 25% of the area, which, if you think about it, is not enough. But if you actually go on consultation figures, it's quite big. Normally in local authority, it's in a small level of single figures of what you get to. We spoke to 100% of the community. I'm sure of that. I knocked on every single door several times myself. But what you will, some people will not respond. It's a cultural thing in terms of response, in terms of gender. There are so many complications. But I generally believe when people say, "Oh my God," they're complaining about the amount of consultation they're getting. Unless they complain to me, I'm convinced they haven't done enough, because I want them to really feel that they're being asked. Some people might not ever respond, but they've got to have that opportunity. And some people, you have to use visual. We use cartoons, we use visual things. A lot of people can't read and write all that well. You've got to think of all these issues. It's not just linguistics in terms of ability to communicate. So the physical contact, the meetings, the ways to express themselves, all that has to be taken into account. So we got to about 25%. I would have liked more, but I'm advised that's quite a lot when you're doing a very large area of 500 or 600 houses. So the communicators were quite pleased that I wanted more, but like, yeah, everyone knew about the project. I can assure you of that.
And there's obviously a common critique of consultation is that it's the loudest voices and the usual suspects who come through the door for consultation. And Aisha, I wonder if you could perhaps draw out that a little bit further. You know, how do you reach out beyond the people who tend to show up?
Yeah, I think, and also, Mhairi, I'd like to talk about value quickly. I completely agree with the value. I think the indicators that we currently have don't actually look at things such as well-being, health benefits, social inclusion, because engagement in the community actually improves inclusion within communities. Bringing people together for a shared purpose is so valuable, but it's overseen by budgets and how much did that cost to put the event together. In actual fact, if you look at the kind of the benefits of these events, such as in Grangetown, all the events that we had at Grange Pavilion, you could see how the community felt they were part of something, which was so lovely to see. In terms of the hard to reach communities, yeah, it's always a challenge for us to do that. But what we've learned now is to actually go into those communities and embed ourselves into those communities. So we will go to places where we know that there's a likelihood of for example, at the moment we're working in Newport in Pill, and a lot of the Sudanese and the Somalian women don't come to a lot of the engagement events. So we've highlighted areas and spaces where these women congregate, whether it's in the park after school or whether they at a local centre, and we're trying to tap into those networks so we can actually engage. And once we're actually in and we're talking, everyone's so open and happy for us to be there, and because they do feel like their voices are being heard, but it does require that extra effort and time. And going back to Ian's point about budgets and timescales and timelines, it does always alter the timescale of the project, because that going out there, making more of that effort will take more time to achieve getting through to those communities.
There's a question here, perhaps I'll direct this to Sandy, is what are the panel's thoughts on how you maintain those valuable community relationships when going through longer consultation projects? I have often seen good relationships with communities lost or forgotten after a particular consultation process has been completed. So I think that does go to the long-term view. So even if you are committing to long-term consultation through the life of a project, how does that carry on in the long term?
Yeah, I think that the term relationship is really key there, isn't it? And often projects can they have a beginning and an end, or it's a task and finish, but that relationships don't work in that way. So seeing them as ongoing and thinking about how that's going to evolve and continue. And I think maybe one of the keys to that is the sort of joined up approach as well, and it sort of touches on a few of the other bits we've already thought about all of those different benefits and kind of the integration across maybe different budget portfolios. So this might start as a sustainable urban drainage project, but actually it has all these other benefits for active travel and cohesive communities. And so I think the more that we can join up and do that integration, principle that's so important in the Act, we can start to sort of see a lot of these community relationships beyond the boundary of a single budget pot or a single project, and it starts to become a much more meaningful set of relationships between the community and our organizations, and that also can transcend then things like, well, somebody leaves, so you know, you don't want to mean for that to mean that all those important relationships leave with that particular member of staff, but you've kind of embedded something a little bit more sustainable.
And similar to Aisha, once you've begun to embed into a community, how do you maintain that long term, or how do you maintain some momentum in the longer term?
I think it is about capacity building within the community and how we have a look at that very early on in the stage. So it shouldn't be seen as a short-term process, but something that can then be passed on to people within the community, and to create those capacities so it's long-term. And I think to do that, again, it's very important to involve those community members very early on. And the one thing that I'm passionate about also is paying people for their time and their efforts. So often you see in communities, a lot of the agencies are using those insights, that valuable knowledge, but people aren't being rewarded for their time and effort. And, you know, voluntary work is all and well, but communities need to be given incentives to be part of the process as well. So by capacity building and having development workers, an approach that housing associations are taking right now, very much so, where they are employing development workers who are actually doing this work long term. And it has to be a long-term commitment, otherwise the momentum just dies, and it doesn't follow through for future projects in the area. So two things: I think people need to be paid for their time, and secondly, it has to be built in terms of capacity building within the process while you're engaging with communities.
Nice. And Ian, you're in a unique situation in that you're a resident of the street that you were consulting on. So you've had people knocking on your doors at all hours, and you're sort of living through the consequences. But I think what particular insights does that give you into what happens after everyone leaves the project?
Well, lesson one is never live where you retrofit. I think lesson two is, I didn't have the resources that I wanted for the post-construction consultation. Obviously we rely heavily on the local councillors to communicate, and recently we carried out a lot of maintenance work on the rain gardens. It didn't require much maintenance after COVID. After 2 or 3 years of having nothing done to them, they worked really well because they were installed well. But I wanted to consult with the residents to explain what we're doing, why we're doing it. I haven't had the opportunity to do it yet because I have to find a budget to do it. And I think post-construction funding for consultation is something we haven't done as an authority, and something I'd like to do. But when you're relying on external funding, such as Welsh Government funding for capital schemes, they wouldn't recognise that as a factor, whereas I do. So it's having that conversation, because when you deal with funding mechanisms, they're siloed vertically. So when I tried to get money for Green and Grangetown, it wasn't a flooding scheme, it wasn't just an environment scheme, it wasn't just a this or that. So instead of getting a little bit of money from everyone, I didn't get anything from anyone. And so I had to use various ways and means to try and get funding for it, through Welsh Water, which was great, through Welsh Government, from the council, but it was too difficult. What I'd like to see, to deliver multi-benefits, to tie in much more closely with the Future Generations legislation, is to have an incentive for multi-benefit funding. So we could, if each department from each council or government, actually there was an incentive to be involved in multi-benefit schemes through part of their funding, what that would do would be to drive the incentive for multi-benefit schemes. At the moment, that's not there. And until we have that sort of incentive for funding, it concerns me that people see it as an addition rather than an essential element of a project. And I think that's what I'd like to see in terms of funding mechanisms, as well as more flexibility with time deliveries on these projects. And I think by doing that, so if a project was multi-benefit project, and it was really serious on consultation, give them more time and a bit more money. If they want to just stick something in and not talk to anyone, give them less time and less money. Give that financial incentive to do the right thing, because it is the right thing to do. And I think there needs to be a financial incentive, because at the end of the day, unless people are forced to do something, when things get tight, they won't do them. It's called value engineering in civil engineering. It's a phrase I hate, because they pull all the nice things out to try and save money. And we need to, with climate change and where we are in terms of society, we need to move away from that form of solution and understand that consultation and multi-benefits go together, partnerships go together, and it's not just warm words, it's something we must do in 2022.
There's a question there about the constraints that you're working within, and one of the questions that's been posted from Johnny is about trust and skepticism when working with governmental agencies and so on. So there's a question saying, do you see challenges in who you are seen to be acting on behalf of, e.g. local government, council, developers, etc., in initiating an engagement activity with whom there may be a fairly deeply ingrained lack of trust or skepticism? Perhaps we could go to Sandy for that, because you're kind of the feet on the ground in terms of trying to understand how Wellbeing of Future Generations is being received and impacting locally.
I think that can be a real challenge, and was discussing in a similar kind of forum recently around that way in which I think the change term, working in a more involvement focused way is a challenge for communities as well, and in many instances people have kind of got used to not being involved, or to consultation being fairly tick box. So I think that also requires communities going on a journey as well, and sort of learning to build that trust, because that's a big difference to say, no, actually now we want you to go on this journey with us and be part of building this solution together, which is a brilliant thing to do, but as we've already talked about, is going to need capacity building in a lot of cases, and is a gradual journey for people to go on. So I can see those challenges that are definitely for public bodies, whether that's local authorities or other organisations. And I think we only overcome that through sort of building these relationships of trust gradually.
I just wonder, how do you introduce yourselves to people as an involvement artist, and what's the understanding of that term when you first describe your role?
Oh, I think always with this slight hint of embarrassment at the job title, because it's a little eclectic. But so I don't know. I mean, I don't always use the actual job title. I suppose I just describe that way in which to people, I'm here for our office to reach out and to involve different people and hear different voices. And that, tends to kind of lead in whatever direction then. So, and that can mean different things depending on what we're working on. And for us, I think one of the challenges is being all Wales wide. So depending on what organisation you are, you might be working in a very focused way with a very geographically specific community, whereas a lot of our work will tend to be very broad policy based, and we'll engage in what we kind of call a broad but shallow way. But then we'll have other opportunities where we can go in really deep and specific with a group, like the co-production I mentioned we're doing with young people around the Act at the minute. So it depends very much, I think, on the situation.
And Ian's mentioned some of the constraints that can come sort of working at a local level, and your role, Sandy, seems to be sort of quite open-ended. It's got that, it doesn't have the time constraint, it doesn't have the really fixed remit. It's an open-ended agenda. Aisha, you've worked on both sides of the family, and I wonder if you could sort of speak to that a bit in terms of how do you build in that trust when you're acting on behalf of others who perhaps don't bring with them that level of trust?
Yeah, I think in my opinion, the voice has to be independent. It has to be an independent organization leading on the co-design, the engagement, the consultation. So I've worked in local authorities across England and Wales, and the response I've received from residents and communities is very much different to whilst working for a local authority than to when I wasn't working for them. There is a lot of mistrust amongst communities, and especially ethnic minority communities and working class communities in particular. I think often the voices of the middle class are heard, and they're put forward when it comes to communities that aren't very upcoming in their voices. One of the main reasons is because the whole thing about mistrust. So whilst working for Cardiff Council, I felt when I was talking to communities, the response I receive now as an independent community engagement consultant is worlds apart. And also to think out the box. I've had, going back to Ian, when you're working in large organizations, the constraints and the whole thing about the feeling about your hands being tied, not being able to push those boundaries, I think now I'm in an amazing position where I can push those boundaries and I can actually think outside the box. And I wasn't able to do that work in a lot of the times in authorities and agencies, if I'm honest with you. So I think the voice, personally, I think it has to be independent. It needs to be an independent person, whether it's somebody from the community or a specialist in engagement and consultation, leading the process. So it's seen as a mutual body in between, representing both sides.
And, you know, obviously one of the ambitions of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is a culture change from bottom up. And so I know that the Office of Future Generations are keen not to impose the act as a stick, but to try and use carrots to enact cultural change. Ian, from your perspective, is that culture change starting to feed down at local levels and at local authority levels? And in what ways are you starting to see it make any kind of difference?
In terms of time restraints, no, there's no change at all, unfortunately. I think the officers I'm working with are very, very keen to have greater consultation. They did watch what I did at Greeley Grange Down, and I think they were jealous that I had so much time and cost of resource to do something. And the ones I work with, particularly in the areas of housing and street redesign, and to really uplift communities that we're doing at the moment in several parts of Cardiff, they're desperate to have more time and resource. And it's not necessarily a decision made by the local authority. It could be Welsh Government funding, and there is a time limit for that spend. And to me, that time limit, that makes no sense, because it frustrates everyone in delivering a more sustainable project for the community. And the more flexibility my officers I work with have, the better, because they're desperate. You know, they're some really, really talented people, and they're desperate to have that time to properly consult, because they realise that if they don't, mistakes are made, and the designs and outcomes aren't as good as they could be. And that's very frustrating for people who are desperate. You know, they work in the public sector. They're desperate to actually do something what they believe in. And that limitation and that time limitation, often it might not be the funding, it'll be the time. I think that's the key factor that doesn't enable people to do what they'd like to do in terms of community conversations.
And Sandy, I'm sure that resonates with a lot of the feedback that you'll be getting face to face and then feeding back into future generations. So what are the next steps along those lines, and what kinds of conversations are happening in future generations at the moment?
I think, as you say, just continuing to feed that in, and it's highlighting what are the boundaries, and that the timing and the funding are things that come up again and again. And I think we're in a position now where we've just come through and are still going through huge changes as well. So a lot of what we hear from organisations is that some of those constraints were kind of lifted during the kind of most acute crisis phase of the pandemic. So I think there's definitely been a focus on, can we learn about how to get rid of those boundaries in normal times and work in a different way. So that's definitely some of the agenda that we're pushing in conversations that we're having with Welsh Government around how can we free up that you know, the ability to collaborate more, to work outside different budget boundaries and to different timescales. So I don't think there are any silver bullets, and I can't promise that as an office we're kind of on the verge of changing all that for the better. But those that, you know, our role is to kind of feed back, you know, what are the blockers and what are the things that helps, whether that's in conversations with Welsh ministers, and yeah, kind of trying to pull the levers of power and decision makers.
Great, thanks, Sandy. So we've got just 2 minutes left, so I'm going to start wrapping up now. And I wonder if I could just go to each of you, put you on the spot for one summary sentence in terms of a recommendation that you'd make. If we could perhaps go to Ian first.
Please give us more time to talk to the people that matter, the people that live and work in the communities we're trying to transform. That time delivers better design, closer relationships, more trust, and better outcomes. More time, please.
Great, thank you, Ian. And Aisha? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Just a quick point about the procurement process as well, in how we actually take on projects. I mean, if there is a section within procurement that's built in around community engagement, community capacity building, I think that would help loads, because all the kind of the consultants coming through and delivering these projects is something they're going to have to consider. And I think they should be assessed on this as well when securing the projects. How far and how deep are they willing to go to engage with communities? And it's almost like forcing their hand into doing this if this is part of the process. And secondly, people are surprisingly they're wanting to get involved and they're wanting to be part of designing and developing the cities they live in. So I think this fear of engagement as well, often which comes across in organizations, needs to be looked at, and how to overcome our unconscious biases and how to become more approachable and change our mindsets in wanting to listen to diverse voices.
Thank you, Aisha. And just to end with Sandy, we're right on the money at 1 o'clock.
Well, there's so much, but I think valuing everybody and the different perspectives that everybody brings is a real core. And then probably building on Aisha's point about the procurement, I think if we can get to that point where we're really doing the multiple benefits and we're thinking about these projects in a way that how do they change lives for people and communities across the whole, and doing stuff much more joined up, then we'll get to a better process of doing this, I think.
Great, thank you all so much for your time today, and thank you for the questions that were posted. This session will be uploaded into the Community Consultation for Quality of Life website, so it'll also be viewable. But I just want to end the session now, and a huge thank you again to Sandy, Aisha, and Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you, diolch yn fawr.
Thank you.